It all started innocently enough, the way these things always do. Jess, my wife of 10 years, had decided to get serious about her fitness. She joined a new gym and even hired a personal trainer, a guy named Blake. I remember the first time she mentioned him, just in passing while we were sitting across from each other at dinner. "He's amazing," she'd said, slicing in her salad with a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in a while. "Blake really knows his stuff." I'd nodded, taking a bite of my own dinner, distracted. I barely registered what she was saying until she started talking about him again. And again. Blake this, Blake that. She told me about how he developed a new plan just for her, how he pushed her harder than she'd ever been pushed. She'd light up whenever she mentioned his name, and it was like I'd dropped a rung on her ladder of priorities without even noticing. Still, I brushed it off. Thought maybe I was reading too much into things. I wasn't the kind of guy to get jealous over small stuff, you know? I mean, everyone needs someone outside the relationship who motivates them, makes them feel good about themselves. So I did what any husband would do. I supported her. Or at least, I convinced myself that's what I was doing. But over the next few weeks, things began to change. Jess, the woman who'd always liked slow, lazy mornings and one glass of wine too many at night, was suddenly up at dawn for sunrise sessions. I'd see her come home later and later, drenched in sweat but also, somehow, radiating energy. Like she'd been plugged into some hidden outlet. It was unnerving, seeing her like that. Happy, yes, but in a way that felt just out of reach, like it didn't have anything to do with me anymore. Then there was the phone. She was glued to it. Texts and notifications would light up her screen constantly, and I'd catch her smiling at them, typing furiously before locking her screen whenever I walked by. And every time I asked who she was texting, she'd wave it off. Just some gym friends, she'd say, or sometimes just Blake talking about my routine. Talking about her routine, yeah. I tried to believe it, but the doubt dug in, its claws scraping away at whatever security I thought I had. Then one evening, she told me I didn't need to pick her up. Blake offered to drive me home, she'd said, trying to sound casual as she tossed her gym bag over her shoulder. My throat tightened as I forced a smile. "Oh, okay," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Guess I'll see you later." And that night, I sat in our empty living room, staring at the darkened TV, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just her trainer, I thought. Just a little harmless attention from someone new. But the idea took root in my mind, twisting deeper with every text, every late night, every time she tossed his name around like he was some new age guru sent to change her life. Maybe it would have stayed just a whisper, a nagging suspicion in the back of my mind, if not for one Sunday morning. We were having coffee together, sitting quietly across from each other, and she'd left her phone on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with a message. I tried to ignore it, but then her face softened, that same look of excitement crossing her face. And before I could stop myself, I looked at her phone. It was a text from Blake. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." My heart started hammering. Jess picked up her phone, read the message, and then looked at me with that same feigned nonchalance, locking her screen as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, something undeniable, and I knew I couldn't brush it off any longer. I went to bed that night feeling like a stranger in my own house, a weight pressing down on my chest as I lay there, listening to Jess breathe peacefully beside me. I kept asking myself if I was overreacting, if I was making up stories in my head. But every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was her face lighting up for him. A seed of doubt had been planted, and I knew there was no going back now. The next week felt like walking through a fog I couldn't shake. Jess's routines were different now, centered around a schedule I wasn't part of. She'd leave early, come home late, and her gym bag became a permanent fixture by the door. I told myself it was just a phase, that maybe she was just, excited about her progress. But my gut wouldn't let it rest. One evening, I decided to pick her up from the gym unannounced. She hadn't asked for a ride, hadn't even hinted at it, but I needed some kind of reassurance. Maybe I'd see her tired, sweaty, but relieved to see me waiting outside for her. I needed something, anything, to break the strange wall that seemed to be building between us. When I got there, I parked outside and waited, hands tapping restlessly on the steering wheel. I tried to convince myself that this was all in my head, that I'd see her walking out of those glass doors alone, and I'd laugh at myself on the drive home. But as the minutes ticked by, unease tightened around me like a vice. And then I saw them, Jess and Blake, walking out together, talking with that easy, casual intimacy that made my heart lurch. He was grinning at her, and she was looking at him in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was like watching the woman I loved drift into someone else's orbit right in front of me. They didn't see me as they walked to his car, laughing like there wasn't a care in the world. I tried to calm myself, reason it away. Maybe he was just giving her advice, just being friendly. But I couldn't unsee the way she tilted her head toward him, the way she leaned into his every word, like he was her whole world at that moment. I sat there, numb, watching them get into his car. My mind went blank, my heart pounding loud enough to drown out any rational thought. I waited until they drove off, then sat alone in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, a sick feeling twisting in my gut. When I finally went home, Jess arrived nearly an hour later. She walked in, acting like nothing had happened, humming softly as she dropped her bag by the door. When she saw me on the couch, she looked almost surprised, like she hadn't expected me to be waiting for her. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "You're up late." I nodded, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Just couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice strained but steady. "Long day?" she asked, already walking past me toward the kitchen, her tone so normal it hurt. I nodded, watching her fill a glass of water, completely unaware of the questions burning behind my silence. But I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to hear the answers. Instead, I let her slide into her story, her version of reality where nothing was wrong. As the days passed, it was like a game we both played. Jess kept up the routine, telling me how her workouts were tough, but worth it, and that Blake was just the motivation she needed. She'd gush about new exercises and techniques, her eyes shining like she was a schoolgirl with a crush. And I kept pretending I didn't notice, didn't care, because facing the truth was like staring into a fire I wasn't ready to walk through. But my patience was wearing thin. Each time I saw her pick up her phone and smile, each time she asked me not to come to the gym, my resolve cracked a little more. I wanted to believe her, to brush off the gut-wrenching suspicion, but every small lie, every late night, chipped away at the trust we'd built over a decade. Then one night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. I knew it was wrong, but I felt like a man drowning, grasping for any piece of reality to keep myself afloat. I reached for her phone, my hand shaking, and opened it. The message thread with Blake was there, and my stomach dropped at the words flashing across the screen. "Thanks for tonight, Jess. Can't wait for the next session." I locked the phone, my heart pounding, the reality settling in like a lead weight. Whatever had been simmering under the surface was real, undeniable. I didn't know exactly what had happened, but I knew enough. Jess, my Jess, was slipping away, and Blake was right there to catch her. And as I sat there, gripping her phone in my hand, I realized the hardest part. She hadn't even tried to hide it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, hearing Jess's quiet breaths beside me, and felt a heavy, sickening mixture of anger and despair that twisted tighter with every passing hour. By dawn, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed answers, a real conversation. No more playing dumb, no more swallowing my pride. That morning, while she was in the kitchen making coffee, I took a deep breath and walked in, my heart pounding like it wanted out of my chest. "Jess," I began, forcing my voice to stay steady, "we need to talk." She looked up, surprised by my tone, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "About what?" "About Blake," I said, sharper than I'd intended. The words hung in the air, and I watched her face shift from confusion to something else, a flash of something almost like fear before she masked it with a nervous laugh. "What do you mean, about Blake?" she asked, her voice too light, too forced. "He's just my trainer, Sam. You know that." "Just your trainer?" I echoed, trying to keep calm, because the other night I was at the gym. "I saw you with him." Her face went pale, and I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't imagining things. Her eyes darted away, and she took a shaky breath, setting the coffee pot down carefully, like any sudden movement might make the situation explode. You were at the gym? She repeated slowly, as if buying time to assemble a response. Yeah, I saw you leave with him. Saw you two get in his car. And I've seen the text, Jess. I wasn't yelling, but every word came out sharper than I'd meant. I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice, and the hurt I'd tried so hard to hide was bleeding through. She stood there, silent, her fingers twisting around each other. Her usual confidence, her easy way with words, suddenly they were gone. All that remained was this silence that stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, she let out a sigh, avoiding my eyes. So, I didn't mean for you to find out this way. I swallowed hard, feeling my chest tighten. Find out what, Jess? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Maybe part of me hoped she'd deny it, laugh it off, tell me it was all some stupid misunderstanding. But she didn't. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Blake, he listened to me, made me feel, I don't know, seen, and it just happened. I felt a stab of pain I hadn't been prepared for, as if hearing her say the words made them that much more real. So what, Jess? I don't see you? I don't listen to you. I felt my voice shaking now, and I struggled to keep control. We've been together for 10 years. I thought we were a team, and now you're telling me some guy at the gym made you feel seen? She looked down, guilt and something else, maybe shame, crossing her face. It's not that simple, Sam, she mumbled. I don't know, it's just with him, I felt different. Like I could escape, you know? Escape? I echoed, feeling like I'd been slapped. Escape what, Jess? Me? Our marriage. Tears started forming in her eyes, but I couldn't find it in me to feel pity. I stood there, waiting, hoping she'd say something that would make this hurt less, give me some excuse to forgive her, to find a way out of this nightmare. But all she did was shake her head, as if she couldn't find the words. I'm sorry, she finally whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed bitterly, a sound I barely recognized as my own. Well, mission not accomplished, I said, turning away before she could see how close I was to breaking. I needed air, space, anything to keep myself from falling apart in front of her. As I walked out of the kitchen, I felt the weight of her betrayal settle heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't just about Blake or a fling at the gym. This was a crack running straight through the foundation of everything we'd built together. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. The days after that conversation were a blur. Jess tried to go back to her routine like nothing had happened, but things were different now, irrevocably different. Every look she gave me felt like an apology she couldn't say out loud, and every time I looked at her, I saw Blake's shadow standing between us. We moved around each other like strangers, each avoiding the other's gaze, filling the silence with hollow small talk, or worse, nothing at all. She'd ask, "Do you want anything from the store, or should I make dinner tonight?" As if these surface-level exchanges could patch the hole she'd torn through our lives. And I'd answer with a nod or a shrug, barely able to summon the energy for more. Sleeping next to her felt like lying next to a stranger. We were in the same bed, but an invisible wall divided us. She'd drift off quickly, or maybe she was pretending. I could never tell. But for me, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing with him, felt the memory of her confession echoing in my mind like a wound that wouldn't close. I'd lie awake, replaying everything over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong, how we'd ended up here. The worst part, though, was watching her go back to the gym. She'd leave the house in her workout clothes, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, and every time I'd feel a wave of nausea, wondering if she was going to see him. Was he waiting for her there, picking up right where they'd left off? The thought gnawed at me, a constant, sickening loop. One evening, after a particularly long stretch of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. She was getting ready to leave, tying her shoes by the door, when I finally spoke up. "Are you still seeing it?" The words came out rough, harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't care. I needed the truth, however ugly it was. Jess froze, her fingers tightening around her laces. For a moment, she just stared at the floor, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Then she looked up, her expression filled with something that looked like guilt, or maybe shame. "No," she said quietly, barely meeting my eyes. I ended it. I told him it was over. I didn't know if I believed her, but I wanted to. I wanted to cling to that sliver of hope, to think that maybe there was still something worth saving. I nodded, swallowing hard. Why didn't you say anything? She shrugged, looking down again. I didn't think you'd care. You haven't even looked at me since we talked. Can you blame me, Jess? I shot back, the hurt spilling over. You kept this secret, let it fester, and now I'm just supposed to pretend everything's fine? She flinched, and for the first time, I saw real pain in her eyes. I know, she whispered. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if I deserve it. A heavy silence settled between us. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she'd hurt me, how her choices had left me feeling like I'd lost everything. But the words wouldn't come. I was too exhausted, too broken to find a way to explain the mess inside my head. After a few moments, Jess stood up, clutching her gym bag tightly. Maybe I should stay somewhere else for a while, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Give you some space. A part of me wanted to say no, to tell her that we could work through this somehow. But another part of me, the part that still felt raw and betrayed, wanted her gone. I needed space, needed time to figure out if there was anything left worth fighting for. I nodded, and she looked down, biting her lip. Without another word, she grabbed her car keys and left, the door closing softly behind her. The house felt emptier than I'd ever imagined, like all the life had drained out of it the moment she walked out. I stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of what had happened sink in. For the first time, I realized that I was truly alone, and I had no idea if Jess and I would ever come back from this. When Jess left, it felt like a relief wrapped in sorrow. The house was quieter, every room echoing with memories of what we used to be. I expected that her absence would give me some sense of clarity, that the silence might offer me the space to piece myself back together. Instead, it only made me realize how much of myself I'd lost in her, in us. I was walking through a familiar space, but everything felt off, like a home stripped of warmth. I catch myself glancing at the door in the evenings, a small part of me expecting her to come back, to undo this mess, to make things right somehow. And each time, the reality hit me. She wasn't coming back, at least not tonight, and maybe not ever. The days slipped into a strange rhythm. I'd get up, go through the motions of work, eat dinner in front of the TV like some automaton, but my mind stayed locked on the what-ifs. What if I'd paid closer attention? What if I'd been better, more attentive, or more understanding? Maybe I'd missed something, some sign that things weren't okay for her. Or maybe she'd just chosen to walk this path alone, without even letting me try to fix things. One evening, out of pure habit, I decided to tidy up the house. I moved through each room, picking up stray items, mindlessly organizing. When I reached our bedroom, I found one of her shirts still lying on the dresser, half buried under a pile of clothes she'd meant to put away. I picked it up, feeling the softness of the fabric between my fingers. It still smelled like her, that familiar mix of lavender and something uniquely Jess. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the shirt like it was some kind of lifeline. Memories rushed in, late nights spent laughing, mornings tangled up in each other, quiet moments that had felt so solid, so unbreakable. I wanted to be angry, to hold on to the betrayal and the bitterness. But sitting there, I could only feel the hollow ache of loss. Maybe that's what hurt the most. That everything we'd shared could unravel so easily, that someone I trusted with every part of me could drift so far away without me even noticing. After a while, I decided to call her. The silence, the solitude. It was suffocating, and I needed to hear her voice, if only to understand what she was feeling, what she wanted now. The phone rang a few times before she picked up. Song. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Yeah, it's me. I hesitated, unsure of where to begin. I needed to talk. This silence, it's killing me. She let out a sigh, and I could hear the weight of her own sadness in it. I know. I've been thinking about it too. About everything. Do you regret it? I asked, surprising even myself with the question. I wasn't sure if I wanted the answer to be yes or no. There was a pause, long enough for my heart to pound. And then she spoke, her voice barely audible. Yes, I regret how much I hurt you. I regret that I didn't come to you first. But I can't take it back, Sam. I wish I could, but I can't. Her honesty stung, but it was the first real conversation we'd had since everything fell apart. I took a shaky breath. So, what now? I don't know, she admitted, her voice cracking. I don't know if we can go back, but I know I don't want to keep hurting you. Her words hung between us, and I realized she was waiting for me to say something, to give her some kind of direction. But I didn't have it in me to make promises I couldn't keep. I'd always believed that we'd be able to survive anything, that love would be enough. But now, faced with the wreckage of that belief, I wasn't so sure. Maybe we need this time apart, I said finally, to figure out who we are without this mess between us. She didn't argue, didn't push back. Maybe you're right. We lingered on the line for a few more seconds, both of us too tired to fill the silence, too drained of fake optimism. Finally, she spoke. Good night. Good night, Jess. As I hung up, the weight of her absence felt even heavier, more real. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing that this emptiness, this uncertain silence, was my new reality. Jess and I had shared so much, and yet now we were worlds apart, trying to find ourselves in the spaces left behind by what we used to be. Days turned into weeks. I fell into a routine that felt hollow but kept me moving. I'd get up, go to work, come home, eat whatever I could throw together, and then collapse onto the couch, numbing myself with mindless TV until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Some nights, I'd stare at my phone, wondering if I should call Jess. But every time, I'd shove it back down, determined to keep my distance, to focus on myself. One Friday evening, after another endless work week, I decided to stop by a bar near our old neighborhood. It wasn't a place Jess and I had ever gone together, just a small, quiet spot with a good selection of local beer. I needed a change of scenery, something that didn't remind me of her, of us. I sat down at the bar, ordered a drink, and tried to clear my head. The noise, the hum of laughter and conversation around me, it felt strangely comforting. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone with my thoughts. I took a deep sip, savoring the bitter taste, letting the moment carry me somewhere outside my usual loop of memories and regrets. As I was nursing my drink, I noticed someone sit down a few seats away. A woman with a kind smile and dark hair glanced over at me and gave a polite nod. I nodded back, surprised at how unfamiliar it felt to acknowledge someone, to even think about engaging with another person in that way. I hadn't realized how closed off I'd become. Rough day, she asked, gesturing to my drink with a knowing smile. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. You could say that. Actually, rough month if I'm honest. She nodded, and there was something warm in her gaze, a look of understanding that made me feel like I didn't have to explain further. I get that. Sometimes it helps to just be somewhere else, even if only for a little while. Her words hit close to home. We started talking, sharing bits and pieces of our lives, the safe, superficial stuff at first. I didn't tell her about Jess, or the weight I'd been carrying. I just let myself relax, slipping into a conversation that didn't demand anything from me. It was light, easy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of normalcy. After a while, she glanced at her watch and sighed. Well, I should get going. Early morning tomorrow. She smiled, picking up her coat. It was nice talking to you, Sam, I said, filling in the blank. Nice talking to you, Sam. She smiled, a touch of sympathy in her eyes, like she understood more than I'd let on. And then, with a final nod, she walked out of the bar, leaving me there with a strange sense of gratitude. As I watched her leave, something shifted inside me. It wasn't attraction, exactly. It was more like hope, a tiny spark I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, I could heal from this. That I could rebuild some part of myself, even if I didn't know what that looked like yet. On the walk home, I thought about Jess, about our marriage and everything we'd been through. And for the first time, my thoughts weren't tangled in anger or regret. Instead, they held a quiet sadness, a kind of acceptance that I hadn't been ready to face until now. I knew I wasn't healed, I wasn't over her or over what she'd done, but I was ready, at least, to consider the possibility that my life wasn't defined by her choices. I could keep going, keep rebuilding, even if it was just one small step at a time. That night, I lay in bed feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I didn't know what the future held, whether Jess and I would find our way back to each other, or whether this chapter was closed for good. But I realized that I didn't have to know. I could let things unfold as they were meant to, without forcing answers or clinging to old wounds. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the woman at the bar, about how a simple conversation with a stranger had reminded me that there was a world outside of this pain. And maybe, just maybe, there was a version of myself waiting on the other side of it, a version I hadn't met yet, but one I was finally willing to discover. In the weeks that followed, I found myself inching back into life in ways that felt unfamiliar but oddly liberating. Without Jess in the house, there was an emptiness I couldn't shake, but there was also a strange, fragile freedom to rediscovering who I was outside of us. It felt like being handed a blank page after a lifetime of someone else's handwriting filling the margins. One Saturday morning, I decided to tackle the boxes in the garage, a project Jess and I had put off for years. They were full of random items we'd collected over the years. Old books, souvenirs from trips, forgotten hobbies we'd started and abandoned together. As I sorted through them, memories resurfaced, some that made me smile, others that stung. Each object felt like a small echo of a life that, somehow, now felt like it belonged to someone else. At the bottom of one box, I found an old guitar I hadn't touched in years. I'd bought it when Jess and I were first dating, back when I still had time for music. I remembered how she'd laughed as I tried to impress her with clumsy chords and half-remembered songs. Back then, I'd loved playing. It had been a way to unwind, to lose myself in something purely mine. I dusted it off, surprised by the pang of excitement it brought. On a whim, I took it back into the house, sat down on the couch, and started tuning it. My fingers were stiff, rusty, but as I strummed the strings, a memory floated back, a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. It became a kind of therapy, an anchor in the middle of the emotional storm. Each evening after work, I'd pick up the guitar and play, losing myself in old songs or learning new ones, feeling the weight of everything slowly loosen with every note. There was something cathartic about it, like I was reminding myself that I still had layers Jess hadn't touched, parts of myself that hadn't been defined by her. One night, in the middle of a quiet song, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Jess. It was the first I'd heard from her in weeks. I stared at it, my heart thudding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "Hey, Sam, just wanted to check in. How are you?" A simple question, but one that felt like a grenade. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay cocooned in the safety of my own healing. But another part of me, the part that hadn't completely let her go, wanted to answer, to share this small piece of growth I'd found in her absence. After a few minutes, I replied, "I'm doing okay. Just taking it day by day." There was a pause, then another message. "That's good. I'm glad to hear it. I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about everything." I wasn't sure I was ready to hear her thoughts, not after all the hurt. But I found myself responding anyway. "And?" She replied, "I know I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope we can talk one day. Really talk. I miss just talking with you." I stared at her words, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. Talking had been exactly what we hadn't done for so long, and now she was reaching out, now that I'd started finding myself outside of her. Still, there was a part of me that craved that connection, that wanted to find closure, to understand where it had all gone wrong. After a long pause, I replied, "Maybe, but not yet." She didn't respond, and that was okay. I needed this time to keep rebuilding, to find pieces of myself that I hadn't touched in years. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as I set my phone down and picked up the guitar again, letting the music fill the silence she'd left behind. Every day, I was learning that healing wasn't linear. Some days I'd feel strong, grounded, like I was ready to move forward. Other days, memories of Jess and everything we'd shared would knock the wind out of me, and I'd find myself grieving all over again. But bit by bit, note by note, I was relearning who I was, who I could be outside of her shadow. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was meeting myself all over again. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth everything I'd lost. One Sunday afternoon, after another week of trying to stitch myself back together, I decided to go for a run. Running had never been my thing, but I craved movement, something to shake off the heaviness I couldn't seem to escape. I laced up my shoes, stretched a little, and headed toward a trail near the edge of town, hoping the open air would clear my mind. The first mile was tough, my legs heavy, and my breath uneven. I was out of shape, more than I'd realized, but it felt good to push myself. The rhythm of my feet hitting the ground, the sound of the trees rustling overhead. It was a reprieve from the mess in my head. Just as I was finding a steady pace, I glanced up and felt my stomach lurch. About 30 feet ahead of me, laughing with a small group of people, was Jess. My heart slammed against my ribs, and for a second, I considered turning around and running the other way. But she hadn't seen me, and something about her presence held me there, as if I needed to see her in this new light, from a distance. I slowed down and watched for a moment. She looked different, lighter maybe. Her laugh came easy, her posture relaxed, and I realized that I hadn't seen her like this in a long time. In some twisted way, it hurt to see her so happy, so vibrant, when I was still struggling to put one foot in front of the other. It felt unfair, watching her thrive while I was still tangled in the wreckage. But then, something else caught my eye. Among the group, a man I didn't recognize was standing close to her. He was tall, athletic, with that easy confidence that instantly put me on edge. He leaned in to say something, and she laughed, resting her hand on his arm in a way that felt intimate, too familiar. I felt a bitter knot tighten in my stomach. Had she moved on already? The thought struck me with a sharp, unexpected pang of jealousy. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching this scene that felt surreal, like looking through a window into a life that could have been ours. Part of me wanted to walk over, interrupt their moment, remind her that I was still here, still trying to piece myself together after everything she'd shattered. But I knew that wasn't fair. She didn't owe me anything, not anymore. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to look away, to focus on the path in front of me. I picked up my pace, my feet pounding harder against the dirt as I pushed myself further down the trail. With each step, I let some of that bitterness drain out, forcing myself to accept that I couldn't control her choices. I couldn't rewrite what had happened. And if Jess had found a way to move on, then maybe I could too in my own way. By the time I reached the end of the trail, my legs were burning, my lungs aching, but a sense of calm had settled over me. I realized that running away from her, literally and figuratively, wasn't going to solve anything. I had to face the reality that we were both on separate paths now, no matter how much I wanted to cling to the past. On my way back to the car, I spotted her again. This time, she was alone, stretching by the trailhead, her face flushed from the run. She looked up and froze when she saw me, her expression a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. We held each other's gaze for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the space that had grown between us. "Hey, Sam," she said finally, her voice soft, uncertain. "Hey, Jess," I replied, managing a small nod. There was an awkward pause, neither of us sure what to say, each of us aware of the weight between us. "You look good," she ventured, a flicker of a smile crossing her face. "It's nice to see you out here." I shrugged, feeling the sting of her words. "Yeah, just trying something new." She nodded, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a hint of regret in her eyes, like she wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she just looked away, the silence stretching again. "Well," she said after a moment, "take care, Sam." "You too, Jess." And with that, we parted, heading in opposite directions. I didn't look back. Driving home, I felt strangely lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted. I realized that seeing her, watching her move on in her own way, was oddly freeing. For the first time, I felt like I could truly start moving forward too, on my own terms, at my own pace, without trying to chase a version of her or us that no longer existed. As I pulled into my driveway, I understood that my path, my healing, didn't depend on her anymore. It was my journey now, and as painful as it had been to let go, I felt ready, finally, to start writing my own story, with or without the shadows of our past. Running into Jess on the trail was like a hard reset. I'd held on to the idea that she was somewhere out there, living in limbo, maybe just as uncertain as I was. But seeing her laugh, watching her with someone new, it forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. She wasn't waiting for me to heal. She wasn't hesitating, stuck in the past. She was living her life, and I realized I had every right to do the same. That next week, I found myself thinking less about the pain of what happened and more about where I wanted to go from here. I took small steps, leaning into the things I'd rediscovered in Jess's absence. I started running every evening, turning it into a ritual that grounded me in the present. I'd lace up, hit the trail, and let my mind clear. Sometimes the runs felt like a victory. Other times they dragged, as if every step was an uphill climb. But they became a way of marking time, a reminder that I was moving forward, one foot in front of the other. On Thursday, as I was finishing up a run, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was Jess. Do you think we could meet up sometime? I'd like to talk, if you're open to it. My first reaction was hesitation. The thought of reopening old wounds made me wince, but there was something else too, a flicker of curiosity, a desire for closure. I knew I needed to understand what had happened between us, to hear her side of things, even if it hurt. Sure, let's meet for coffee, I replied after a moment's pause. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from her in a small cafe we used to frequent. Jess looked nervous, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitated, then tried again. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, her voice soft. I know, I don't deserve it." I nodded, not sure what to say. I was here to listen, but a part of me still felt guarded, wary of reopening the pain I'd worked so hard to contain. She took a breath, glancing out the window before meeting my gaze. "I owe you an apology, Sam, and an explanation. What I did with Blake, it wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to us." I sat back, waiting, letting her words sink in. "I didn't realize how far I'd drifted until it was too late," she continued. "It was like I was chasing this feeling, this idea of someone who could take me out of my own life for a little while. And I got lost in that." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, blinking back tears. "I just wanted to feel like I was someone else for a while. I thought I could compartmentalize it, keep it separate from us. But I was wrong. I hurt you, and I hurt myself in ways I didn't expect." Her words settled heavily between us. Hearing her admit the truth, laying it all out without excuses, was both painful and strangely freeing. There was no longer any illusion, no hidden shadows. Just the reality of what had happened and the aftermath we were both living with. "I won't pretend I understand it, Jess," I said quietly, my voice rough. "But I get wanting to escape. I felt it too, in my own way. I think we both forgot to take care of what we had because we assumed it would always be there." She nodded, wiping a tear away. "I wish I could go back, but I know I can't. I'm trying to learn from it, to understand why I let things get so far." I looked at her, seeing the regret etched into her face, and felt a surprising wave of compassion. This was the woman I'd loved, who'd hurt me, but who was also here, vulnerable, admitting her faults. For the first time, I saw that we were both flawed, both learning, both stumbling forward in the mess of it all. "Maybe we both have to let go of the idea of going back," I said. "We're different people now. I think we always will be." She looked down, nodding. "I think you're right." We sat in silence for a moment, the quiet comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. There was no neat resolution, no fairy tale ending. But there was understanding, a shared sadness, and maybe, finally, acceptance. As we stood up to leave, she reached out and touched my arm. "I really hope you find happiness, Sam. You deserve it." I managed a small smile. "You too, Jess." Walking out of that cafe, I felt a weight lift. There was still hurt, still the echo of what we'd been, but I knew now that I didn't need her forgiveness, or even her presence, to move forward. I had what I needed: clarity, closure, and a glimpse of the path ahead, free of the shadows of what once was. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take that first step into the life waiting on the other side. Leaving that cafe felt like walking out of a fog. For the first time in months, I could see the world without the haze of grief or the sharp edges of resentment. Jess and I had shared a lot of beautiful moments, and we'd built a life together, one that had meant something, even if it had ultimately unraveled. Now, there was nothing left to dissect, nothing more to hold on to. I could feel myself moving on, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, I went home, made myself dinner, and sat down with my guitar. I played a few songs, letting my fingers move easily over the chords, each note grounding me in the moment. Music had become my anchor, a way to reconnect with myself, and I felt gratitude for the small but powerful ways it had pulled me out of the dark. I didn't feel that tug in my chest when I thought of Jess anymore. Instead, I felt something closer to a quiet peace, a sense of finality that didn't need explaining. As the days went by, I leaned into my new routines. I made a habit of running the trail, reconnecting with old friends, and even picking up new hobbies I'd always been too busy for. I signed up for a photography class, which I'd always wanted to try, but never made time for. I'd take my camera out on hikes, capturing details I'd never noticed before: sunlight filtering through leaves, small birds resting on branches, quiet scenes that reminded me of the beauty and simplicity. One Saturday morning, while out taking photos, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Sarah, the woman I'd met at the bar weeks ago. She was out walking her dog, a shaggy, joyful mutt who immediately ran up to me, tail wagging like I was his long-lost friend. "Sarah," I greeted her, feeling a spark of warmth at the familiar face. "Out enjoying the morning?" "Always," she replied, grinning as she bent down to scratch her dog behind the ears. "This is Charlie. He's pretty much my excuse to get out of the house." We started talking, picking up our conversation from the bar, as if no time had passed. She had an easy way about her, the kind of presence that felt steady and open. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people sharing stories, walking under the sun, letting the day unfold. Eventually she asked, "How have you been? You seem different in a good way." I paused, realizing she was right. I did feel different, lighter somehow. "I'm doing okay," I said, smiling at the realization. "Better, actually. It's been a strange journey, but I think I'm finally learning how to be me again." She nodded, a soft understanding in her eyes. Funny how that happens, isn't it? Sometimes you have to lose yourself a bit to figure out who you really are. As we talked, I felt a quiet excitement I hadn't felt in a long time, a gentle nudge towards something new. We ended up walking together for over an hour, sharing stories, laughing at each other's jokes. By the time we parted ways, I felt a sense of connection I hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that needed to be defined or dissected. Just a small, promising start. In the following weeks, Sarah and I began to meet regularly for walks or coffee, keeping things simple, letting a friendship grow at its own pace. She became someone I looked forward to seeing, someone who reminded me that life could still be filled with warmth and possibility, even after heartbreak. I didn't know where things would go with her, and for once, I didn't feel the need to rush toward answers. With every passing day, I found myself building a new life, not as a response to the old one, but as something that stood solidly on its own. I wasn't starting over, or trying to replace what I'd lost. I was just living for myself in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, I sat on my porch with my guitar, watching the colors bleed across the sky. I strummed a gentle tune, thinking about how much had changed, how far I'd come from the person I'd been when Jess left. I thought about her, but the thought didn't hurt. It was just a small piece of my story now, a chapter I'd read and closed. And as the last light faded, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. I knew the road ahead would have its own twists and turns, that I'd face new uncertainties, new joys, and new heartbreaks. But I wasn't afraid. I was ready to take each step forward, open to whatever life would bring, trusting in my own resilience to carry me through. This time, I wasn't holding on to anything but myself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.